Yeah, welcome back Dominators, welcome back to the VShare channel. So I have a very great deck right in front of me from Jonathan Tan. Basically, he's the
Third place at
guy
ACQ.
at third place ACQ with his Gear Chronicle Gyze deck. And yeah, we're going to do that recipe about it because a lot of people have been asking like, what, Gear Chronicle Gyze in top 3? How is that even possible? So I'll let the guy himself take it away, and yeah, you'll see how that works.
Okay, folks. First, thanks for having me. Thank you so much, especially to all you Dominators. This has been a great show. And so, before I get started, shout out to Zark Games because they've been supporting, and this is a shop where I work and train at. Shout out to all the people that have been supporting us. And before I get any further, let's just get to the deck list. So, recently I just went for Asia Championship at Singapore. That was about last Sunday, and I placed third in the premium format using Chrono Fang Gyze. So it's not a very popular deck right now. I know a lot of people say like Gyze in this meta is dead, it dies to rush, Ezreal will beat the shit out of it. Pro tip, I killed the Ezreal in round 4, in top 4. Sorry, flexing aside. Yeah, okay. Let's get down to the deck list. First, I'll say Chrono Fang is one of those G3 grade 3 bosses from the G era that have been forgotten for so long. Like, I know there's a lot of fans, and to all you fans out there, I hope that the tech that you learned today might help you improve your own decks. You don't have to play Gyze, but nonetheless, I hope you guys learned something from it. So, naturally, the boss of this deck is Chrono Fang. So, I'll get down into the grade ratios first before I get into strikes. So, the grade ratios here will be, I play, let's get that out of the way. I played 4 Chrono Fang. Yes, I have max rarity them, facts. And 4 Mystery Flare. So this is the V era Mystery Flare. I'll break down into why I use that in a sec. It's actually quite core to one of the deck's key win conditions. So you play the fact for Chrono Fang because it allows you to bind using its GB2 skill, so that you can bind any card in hand to achieve what's essentially an easy strike. And in addition to that, it has an on-right skill to bind. The removal, when you place it on the Vanguard circle. So you can remove any card on your opponent's side of the field that's a rear guard and send it to the deck, and your opponent has to may call a card that's up to 2 grades slower. You probably already know this, so I'm just giving you guys backdrop for people that don't know what Chrono Fang does. That skill's not really important. All you really gotta care about the fact is that it puts a card in the bind, and that matters early because once you get a certain number of bind, the engine really starts to take off. So, having said that, this is going to be your main grade 3, and through most of the game you want to be sitting on him. If you're not on him, I don't know what you're on because I don't actually have another grade 3. So, let's work on the grade 2 lineups. So, people are wondering as well, like, why do we play Mystery Flare? Is it because you can ride that and get a grade? No, actually you play Mystery Flare for just one condition only. You almost never ride it as a main Vanguard. You don't use it to try and win games like through its usual skills. You don't care about the crit drive. There's no Lost Legend in this. I know some players have been trying out Chrono Fang with Lost Legend and Mystery Flare, and that's fine. That's a cool deck, and I fully appreciate the effort you guys have put into that deck. But that's not what this deck does. This deck is designed around our Lord and Savior, our Master Gyze. A moment of silence. But yeah. So I know some people might say Gyze is an unfun mechanic, like he prevents players from thinking, but I challenge that perspective that it's not the card, but it's how you approach the win con that makes it whether it's fun or not. Like, we've all seen a billion versions of Gyze in the form of Angel Feather, of Shadow Paladins, of Oracle Think Tank, and I'm saying that this is a Gyze that isn't afraid to go on offense if it has to. But enough thought, let's break down the deck. So going down to the grade 2 section, I run a grand total of 2 of these grade 2s. I'll break down the effect later. 4 of this Zodiac Time Beast, 3 Chrono Fang grade 2 support, and 3 Lost Break Dragons. So to break it further down, based on the effects, the key cards you gotta focus on cards that activate in the bind zone. So that's Nadine as well as Clash Monkey. So the monkey, in short, is basically your bread and butter engine. When it's bound, face up, generation break 1, you can pay the cost of Counter Blast 1 and you draw a card. This card triggers regardless of how you bind it, whether you bind it as a cost for your abilities, binding it from the drop zone, binding it as an effect, or getting bounded by, say, Narukami's abilities. It all triggers, as long as Generation Break is active. A secondary ability is that it calls itself in the bind zone for Soul Blast 1, which is good because it prevents cards from getting trapped inside the soul. As for Nadine, this is a card that requires you to have a Chrono Fang Vanguard, and it triggers from the bind zone. By paying the cost of Counter Blast 1 and binding a card, you can call it to the Rearguard Circle if you have, and it gains power in equal to the number of cards in the bind zone, 1000 power for each. So if you have 3 cards, it'll call itself out. If you have 5 cards, you'll get a Soul Charge 1 and a draw 1. Strictly speaking, the real effect is just call it to the field. If you have 3 in bind, you Soul Charge 1. If you have 5 in bind, you draw 1. And the power is nice, but that's not really why we play her. You've got Lost Break, which is a good general non-GB card where you can play it and bind any card you want to draw for another card. It lets you go through the deck a little faster. And for my latest ACQ version, one that I didn't pilot or test before, I ran this version, which is this grade 2 that allows me to bind any card in drop. So I can get cards that I used to have lost or thrown out for strike, and I get them back into play. So I'll get down that into the strategy section later. So for grade 1s in this deck, it's all about the recursion because it turns out I actually go through the deck really fast. So most of my cards are actually centered around recursion, except for one key exception which I'll go into later. So I'll break down the deck into grade 1 sections into 2 types, which is stuff that returns cards to the deck, and then stuff which doesn't. So this doesn't send cards to the back, and this sends everything to the back. Okay, we've got Zodiac Time Beast here, Heck Out. Skills pretty straightforward. On place, if you have a grade 4, you Soul Charge 1, and if you Soul Blast 1 and return itself and a card in the drop zone to the bottom of the deck, you can Counter Charge 1. It's useful because this deck actually eats through a lot of Counter Blast. You've got Quickie Walker. It's on place, and if you return any grade 3 or higher in the drop zone to the deck, you get the Soul Blast and draw 1, which is our main way of freeing up cards stuck in the soul, aside from Monkey. And lastly, there's this grade 1. The skill is basically the Counter Blast 1, GB1 of course. Choose 2 cards in your bind zone, return them to the deck, and if you choose up to 2 cards. If you choose less than 2 cards, you just return the deck and shuffle. If you choose 2 cards, you draw a card and Soul Charge 1. So this frees up any triggers that we bind as an effect, and has obvious synergies with certain cards that I'll go through later. The main difference that this deck has with people that have come up with this build before, like shoutouts to Proof Quad for originally pioneering this. Thank you, Kuro. Like this grade 1, which most people have probably forgotten about, originated from the trial deck, the very first Gear Chronicle trial deck. It has a really simple effect that's not Generation Break. It's 6k base power, and it gains 5000 anytime anything attacks it until the end of the battle. Long and short of it, I'll just call it anti-rush. Like if you try to rush me with 9ks, this thing's not gonna take it. If you try to rush me with 7ks and 8ks, this thing will refuse to take. And if you attempt to swing single column into me, you're gonna go for trigger pass. While you may feel that this is anti to the idea of Gyze wanting to get as many damage checks as possible, my experiences have been shown that people will give you the damage eventually. It's just that you don't want to take too much damage too quickly at a point in time where you can't use any of it. So this card's Steam Battler Toge, I think. I can't recall the EN dub's name for this, but I'm sure you guys online can probably look it up. It's from the very first Gear Chronicle trial deck. And that's probably about the most unique version of this deck, which I'll go into it in the combo section later. So last section before we break down the strikes is that we've got the trigger section. So a lot of these triggers are really useful. We've got of course the 20ks, these are just good for raw shield value, and we have the Chrono Medical Hamster from GBD 14. This card's actually one of your key ways to get triggers into your bind zone so you can shuffle through the grade 1 that I mentioned earlier. It also opens up counter blasts by letting you counter charge or soul charge, which are really good because it enables you to pay costs that your opponent usually wouldn't think that you could. As for Perfect Guards, I'm using 4 draw triggers from the V series. So that's just a regular 10k trigger. 10k power doesn't really matter because you don't get trigger powers due to being Gyze. But the ability to guard with a draw trigger means you have more room in your grade 1 to run utility options. I run another pair of draw triggers. Pro exception is that this is 5k. Again, power doesn't actually matter, but the key important word is that this card is a Zodiac Timepiece, so I can actually use it to shortcut for the cost of Altered Dragon, in addition to just generally being quite cute. It is a Zodiac Timepiece. And now another legacy card. This is Wakey Walker. You guys probably haven't seen this card all the way from GBT01. For those of you that are just joining us from Standard and just figuring out Premium, GBT01 is a really old set that came out way back in 2015, 2014, and if we're counting Japanese format, but its effect is really simple. At the end of the battle, it boosts us. You can return it to the deck and shuffle your deck, and in exchange you choose one face-up G unit in your G zone and flip it face down. This can be a Stride, this can be a G Guard. You could flip down the Gyze if you really want, but it's not a G unit, so don't try that. You probably get DQ'd. But and last bit is the defensive trigger wall. Night Tabby, Night Barking Tab, Gear Tabby, which is a Chrono Fang support. Its effect is basically it's non-GB. When bound from the rearguard circle, if your Vanguard is a Chrono Fang, you can place it into your soul and give your Vanguard 5k power for the rest of the turn, and you draw a card. So this card's actually quite key to surviving your turns, because when you bind it for the cost of a certain G guard, I will go into it shortly, it generates a wall that you can't easily break through. And this was quite key in one of my matchups for my second round where I went up against a Great Nature player. So that's more or less about the main deck for triggers wise. The only thing that's left is we go into the Stride Zone. So hope you guys can entertain this because most of it's quite a little bland. So our first Stride is a Zark Dragon and another Zark Dragon. Another Zark Dragon. I think you guys see where I'm going with this. It's just Zarok in general. So I play 5 Zark Dragons, which is more or less what you're required to. And then we go into Split Pegasus as a Zodiac Timepiece, Altered Dragon, Gear Glare, a second Gear Glare because it flips itself as cost, and Chronovisor Heritage. And that is more or less all my default strides. After this, I've got 6 G-Guards, so Paradox Chimera, Raphanau, a copy of the Zodiac Timepiece G-Guard, Pulsar Saber Ilushu if I'm not wrong, another copy of her for Heritage memes, and then the Pure Resistance, Bearlock. The actual term is just Bearlock, like bear as in the animal and lock as in the broken mechanic that we don't talk about. Basically, what Bearlock does is that it allows me to pay the cost of G-Guarding without dropping a heal from my hand. So I just need to bind cards whose total grades are equal to 3 or higher, and for each card bound through this effect, I gain 5k shield to itself. This ability is activated from the G zone, so I don't have to have 3 or less face-up G-Guards. This card can be triggered even though I have 4 face-up G-Guards. This card can be triggered even though I haven't achieved a heal in hand or anything. Also, the only restriction is that it's Generation Break 1, so I can't do it for my first G-Guard. But all in all, this promo for you Western players here is not yet fully released in English. We have no clue when it's released, and without this one important G-Guard, this whole deck kind of just falls apart. So sorry for the Western players. I know you guys were excited to hear about Chrono Fang deck, but give it time. Ask Bushiroad as much as you can. Send in all the picket requests you want. Petition them until they die. Just make sure that if you guys can get this card in English, then you guys get to play this deck. I hope you have fun with it. But in the meantime, for the rest of you trying out on CFA, you've probably been playing this deck. Again, shout out to Proofcord who originally played this deck. Thank you guys for the inspiration. And moving on. So the base, aside from the Zark Dragons, the most important thing is that this deck runs about a grand total of 6 Zodiac Timepieces. And your first stride is almost always going to be Altered Dragon, because you can either A, shortcut the initial cost of stride by banishing a binding a Zodiac Timepiece, or just striding for it normally. And what it does is that its only effect is to flip a card, Split Pegasus, and review the top, check the top 5 cards of your deck and choose up to 2 cards to bind. And if you have 5 or more bound cards in the G zone, you can countercharge one, and the Vanguard gains plus 2000 power for each card binded. So the power is irrelevant, the countercharge is kind of nice, but more importantly, it just gets cut in your bind zone. And that's how this engine entirely starts. Split Pegasus is just there because it's a Zodiac timepiece and it gives plus 1000 power while face up. There's no real hidden meaning, and I don't actually intend to use its effect, nor should you ever. But moving on. Gear Glare. Well, this card's also a Zodiac timepiece. It's a very good removal option because it has a generation break tree that gives it drive +1, crit +1, and 10k power if it meets the condition of 5, 7, or 9 cards in the bind zone. In addition, you can Soul Blast one and flip it, a copy of itself, and bottom deck any number of your opponent's rearguards whose total grades don't exceed the number of cards in your bind zone. So that's usually good when your opponent attempts to overcommit to the field and call a lot, attempting to rush you out because you're, Gyze. But in general, it's just good because you can get quad drive. And one of the interesting things about this that most people sometimes forget about is that because you get your drive checks, and when you drive check a trigger, you can instantly bind through Gyze's effect. It means that you can actually achieve the ability to drive +1 if you have the right number of drive checks, trigger checks in your initial attack. For example, take it like I have 8 cards in the bind zone, so my opponent guards for, doesn't guard, I swing for 3 cards, I check 1 trigger, I instantly bind 1 card of a Xerath Dragon, my bind zone goes to 9 cards, I gain an extra drive. So usually this extra drive does a lot. Like I get an extra trigger, I get an extra Xerath Dragon bounded, I get my conditions met, or I hit a power level that they didn't expect. It also helps on lower levels, like if I have less than 5 and my opponent guards for 5k because Gyze technically can't gain power to break it, so he guards minimum pass, and then I just check 1 trigger, bind a card, and instantly break through because I just gained 10k power. It's a cool combat trick. It's not really game breaking or anything, it's just cute. But usually the extra drive helps, and on 7 you get a crit +1, which goes into this game's alternative backup turn where you can just pressure with a 2 crit vanguard before drives. I mean, most people don't expect Gyze to ever attack face, but so if they no guard your Gyze and then you show them a crit and then you show them an actual crit trigger, that's ground for you having an alternate win con. And after you use that stride, you can always just go into Heritage and flip it down and do it all over again. So that's the G zone in a nutshell. As for the strides, for the G guard, I should say, Paradox is there because you get rid of pesky rear guards that you can't usually touch and which your opponent doesn't count on. Most people seem to confuse this with Hetera, which is a Chrono Jet exclusive card. This card's only ability is just to Counter Blast one, choose one of your opponent's back row, and bottom deck it. But depending on the matchup, this can shatter complete game plans, like from reducing the number of counts for Victor or Anje or Blaster, or even getting rid of Flow Gauls and removing an entire restand just because your opponent forget it does this thing. It's not really good for guarding in terms of shield value, but it's good for removing cards that your opponent forgets about because it's such an old piece of card that no one really remembers it. Raphael. This card's a good synergy with the rest of my grade 0 section because it lets me search for any 0 I want by bottom decking a grade 1 or higher. So I can return any grade 1, usually my grade 1s the recycle cards, and then I get a crit trigger, usually Barking Tabby. And then using that skill, I can just bind that through Balog. As for this, no brainer, it's a simple Soul Blast one, it gains 5k if I have 1 card in the bind zone and 20k if I have 5 cards in the bind zone, so it's just good for raw shield value. So this combined with Balog can usually guard nearly everything. I think in my games against one of my Mega Colony players, I managed, in ACQ, I managed to stop the entire Zoa attack by raw guarding using just Balog and Pulsar Saber. But there's a funny story about that, maybe I'll explain about that later. So let's talk about the deck's main win cons. The deck is a Gyze deck, so technically the main combo is always using Gyze to deal 5 damage, right? But in case some of our viewers that forgot or are new to Gyze, for example, Gyze usually wins by having 5 Xerath Dragons on the field, and it deals 1 damage for every at the start of your turn, your next turn, before you draw, for every Xerath on the field. So usually getting 5 damage straight usually wins you games, but the problem with Gyze is that after you ultimate strike, your opponent gets one entire turn where they can't do anything. They can do anything they want, and if they survive that turn, then they take 5 damage. So the key difference about this deck is that we are trying to skip that extra turn so that our opponent can't get to any shenanigans, and they just take 5 damage instantly. And to do that, this is going to combine Gyze with one card that I showed earlier, which is Mystery Flare. So Mystery Flare's ability, in case you guys forgot, is that when I place it on the Vanguard Circle by riding, if I have achieved a certain number of cards whose grades exceed a certain amount, I'll trigger multiple effects. So if I have 3 cards in the bind zone, I gain drive +1. If I have 7 grades in the bind zone, as in a grade combination of 7 or higher, I get critical +1 in addition to the drive +1. If I have 13 combined grades in the bind zone, I get a 10,000 power to all of my units on the field. And if I have 19 cards in the bind zone, then at the end of my current turn, during the end phase, I can pay the cost. I, as in I, the player, not the card, it's not an ability tied to a card. The effect allows me, the player, to discard my entire hand and gain an extra additional turn. So this ability is, that last ability is the only reason why we're playing this. By using that last ability and then immediately ultimate strike, paying the cost of ultimate strike by discarding another Mystery Flare, I'm able to enter Gyze, and at the end of that turn, because the ability to gain an extra turn is on the player, I can then discard my entire hand and gain an additional turn. At the start of an additional turn, my Gyze Vanguard will trigger the ability to deal 5 damage to my opponent. So usually there's no response in between, and it skips the entire turn. So most decks that usually have a Gyze counter to this, for example, Phantom Blaster Diablo, where the Gyze usually typically can't guard, they don't have an out this. And so it's as much as a be all and end all. But of course, you have to maneuver in a situation where you have 2 of these, and in addition to that, you need to be able to survive that long. So that's what this deck is designed to do. It gets you your pieces, it gets you your drive checks, and then it finishes the game with an answer that your opponent can't easily come up with. And that's really the core functionality of this deck. But at the end of the day, this deck is not really designed to win games. Like, I'll be honest about it. Like, this deck is really, I brought this deck into ACQ not as a show because I think it's the best deck. I just think it's a fun deck to bring in. I brought it to premium. It's fun. But I'll pro tip tell and I'll just tell you guys right now, this deck isn't even that consistent, because end of the day, it's Gyze. If you don't get your triggers, you die. And the reality is that this deck is trying to get Gyze done in a way that's different than the usual. But if you're a player that's looking for efficiency and you're looking for the best deck in the format, then I'll tell you upfront, this isn't the deck. Go play RG or something. That's probably a better deck. But from my perspective, for the players that actually like Chrono Fang and just want to see a way to move on, I hope you guys will stay with me for that. So, moving the Seraph Dragon aside, one of the key combinations of Gyze, or rather this build of Fang Gyze, is that a lot of the cards work in the bind zone, which is Nadine. And these cards work by getting themselves into the bind zone, or Monkey. So, for the people that forgotten the effects, Monkey, when binded, Counter Blast 1, draw a card. For Nadine, activated skill, Counter Blast 1 while in the bind zone, call itself to the Vanguard Circle if you have 3 or more cards in the bind zone. And this card gives power plus 1000 for each card in the bind zone. If you have 3 cards, you soul charge 1, and if you have 5 cards, you draw a card. So this nets you advantage, and more importantly, both of them set up the combo when chained with Belloc. So the actual ideal position you want in the field is having a Chrono Fang Vanguard, any amount of Nadines or Monkeys, and possibly a few Night Tabbies, as many as you can. So this is usually what we call considered an ideal field, but it's quite prone to disruption. So I'll say up front that this combination is just by paying the cost of Belloc and binding 5 rear guards. You can bind 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and using their abilities in sequence, you get to show in 3 cards and draw 3 cards from the monk, and then counter blast one and draw an additional card. So you can go just +4 despite getting a giant shield of 40k. And the bonus point is that your Vanguard gains additional permanent 5k for the rest of this turn per every tabby cat. So you can actually stop a rush from happening just by binding ahead of time, which is quite interesting. And can actually stop matchups if your opponent just doesn't know what this card does. This card's good. It's not very expensive. It's quite rare because you have to get it comes from an exclusive minivan book that I purchased from Amazon Japan. Shoutouts to Amazon Japan. But more importantly, it's a good card, and I hope you English players will eventually get to use it, because you guys get reprinted everything, nearly everything, at a better rate. Belloc is a useful card, and to get around the fact that you only have 2 copies, that's why it comes back to using Wakey Worker to recycle the number of times you can use Belloc. So let's talk about basic turn strategy. This deck begins on 1 with a usual opening. You actually have a very specific combination. It's not a very special plan or anything, but you just want to sit on a specific vanguards. So your opening right ideally would actually best be on this. Tauge has the ability to be swing under most cards base. Because of its 6000 power, it can actually swing under, and because Gyze prevents cards from getting triggers, you actually are unable to hit any opponent that's power above you. Because it's 6000, you basically can't deal damage to anything above you, which prevents opponents from using counter blasts to rush you or beat the crap out of you before you're ready. Also, because it gains 5k when you attempt to rush it, it prevents you from dying to grade 1 rushes or grade 2 rushes, and lets you move on to the second play. The second part of the thing is that a lot of these grade 2s have an 8000 base, so if your opponent attempts to ride a 9k or 10k base in a V series, you can swing under them, and as per the rules of Gyze, you cannot add trigger power on any of their attacks. So long and short of it is your opponent's not getting a damage. No damage, no play. And this seems like a really cheap tactic as well, but at the end of the day, this deck tries to have fun, just that it's not going to be able to do that if your opponent gets 3 counter blasts and kills you before you do anything. So it's all about trying to work out a balance. I'm not saying you should never deal any damage to your opponent because you gotta win the game somehow, but end of the day, it happens to work out that they're all lower power than most of your average Vanguard. This can actually bite you in the ass as well, because once you have 8k, or once you ride up to grade 2, you no longer have Tauge's protection, so your opponent can rush you at that point. And you may find yourself unable to guard because you can't get defensive triggers. But usually, since you're already grade 2, you just need to endure this for a turn and then ride up to grade 3 and hopefully turn the game around from that point. So, in addition, on the inverse scale, if your opponent actually has multiple rearguards and you don't need to swing under them, you can also ride on Lost Break. So Lost Break gets you the +1 draw on, and because it's 10k base, it works the same opposite principle of being under. Now they can't hit you because you're more base than XL or Protect Clans 9k or old G era cards with a 9000 base power. So this also is a bit of anti-rush, but more importantly, this forces you to give 1 damage to your opponent. End of the day though, it's only for 1 turn, and there are a lot of good synergies in this deck. So once you make it to grade 3, usually if you're ahead or you have the resources to spare, you usually can start by binding cards such as Nadine or Monkey and achieving the first effect, which is a form of removal. It's not a very good form of removal, like compared to Kagero or Narukami or even Blue Eye, who has much better retires. But at the very least, all you really care about is the fact that a card goes into bind zone and increases the count of the bind zone. So the second benefit is that by binding these 2 cards, they can instantly come back to the field for the cost of Soul Blast 1 or Counter Blast 1, and you get a card from them or a card from them later. So it all works out in general. So I brought this deck for ACQ, because I thought it was fun, but I mentioned that earlier. But the reality is that this deck isn't very high on the tier list. Like if you subscribe really closely to tier list, Anji is God, the true God, and I'm a false God. It's like Omanite and was it Mew? Arceus, whatever. The point is, it's hard for this deck to come on the tier list. Usually you get wins because your opponent doesn't understand what's going on, and then you just shoot them for 5 damage, and then they just shake your hand and call you a scumbag. But in general, this deck wins because your opponent doesn't know what's going on, and by the time they do, you're already so far ahead. I'm not saying that the only way this deck wins is through Gyze. In fact, one of my wins for ACQ involved grinding my opponent to using Chrono Visor Heritage, which is interesting because it gives you 6 drive checks, and it gives you a draw in between, and it lets you reset all your useful strides. Also, I was playing against a Mega Colony player who didn't really know this deck, so that helped a lot. But ultimately, I was quite impressed with the players at Asia Circuit, and I hope I'll see them again for this year's WGP. Yeah.
Alright, so thank you very much, John, for being in the video. Shout out to him again. Thank you very much for his deck recipe, and then shout out to Zark Games as well for allowing me to record at their place. Check out Zark Games; it's a really cool place where I come to play Vanguard as well. And yep, I'll see you Dominators in the next video. Peace.